Alright folks, today I am here once again to bring you yet another case of environmental storytelling in the Walking Dead universe. As most of you probably already know, I have an entire playlist with over 20 of these videos which you can click right here, but if this is somehow your first time watching, environmental storytelling is a filmmaking technique where a series of objects or bodies will be laid out in a way that conveys a story to the viewer without explicitly stating what that story is. In today's video, I'm going to be exploring the vacant funeral home scene in Season 4, Episode 13, Alone, which on the surface may seem like a rather cut and dry story, but I believe may have more to it than meets the eye. I'm going to structure this video by taking you through the scene as it was first presented, before going back and attempting to reinterpret what we discovered into a coherent story. So with that, if you have suggestions for future topics, let me know in the comments down below, and if you end up enjoying this video, I'd greatly appreciate it if you dropped a like on your way out. Following the governor's devastating attack on the prison, our survivors were left separated and scattered across the wasteland with little hope of ever finding each other again. One of the few pairs to make it out together were, of course, Daryl and Beth, who, despite believing they may be the only survivors, found comfort within each other while coping with their grief, which soon bloomed into a strong friendship and mentorship, with Daryl teaching Beth the ways of survival. But unfortunately, accidents do happen as we see Beth step into a bear trap while hunting a walker. A bear trap tactically placed in a clearing complete with bait in the middle, obviously designed to trap walkers for reasons that'll become clear shortly. This accident would leave Beth without the ability to walk long distances, but fortunately, the two found themselves on the outskirts of a seemingly abandoned funeral home which would surely have some sort of medical supplies inside. Right away, we can see this place has been well maintained since the fall, as the headstones remain clean and de-weeded 2 entire years into the apocalypse. The house still remains boarded up, indicating whoever lived here wasn't naive to the horrors outside, but interestingly, despite the precautions, left the front door unlocked, allowing the two to freely walk inside, where, much like the exterior, we see the inside spotless and maintained as well. At first, you'd probably think this place just hasn't been looted since its abandonment, but Daryl is sure to make note of a lack of dust, indicating this place has probably only been vacant for a day or two, or hell, may not be abandoned at all. We see shelves entirely stocked with supplies, so whoever has been living here didn't just move on from their base. So, who and where are they? Regardless, we can at least extrapolate a lot about this individual's character just from the scene they left behind. Clearly, this survivor was a mortician in the pre-outbreak world, with this not only being their business, but their home. Around the parlor, we see deceased bodies embalmed, dressed, and presented in ways that look like attempts to hold funerals for those who were lost to the wasteland. This isn't presented as a creepy act, but a way to honor the dead when nobody else can. It's clear the mortician here would place bait around the home in order to lure walkers into bear traps so he could release them from their never-ending nightmare and bury them once and for all, which shows us their selfless nature and conveys the good they wanted to bring into this dark world. Although, for some reason, they never got the chance to bury these bodies, which tells me their absence here isn't of their own volition. Why leave when you have everything you could ever need right here? This wasn't a Father Gabriel situation. This individual had food. And judging by how routine this funeral process looks, I doubt they needed to go find a shovel or embalming fluids, so what gives? I do find it interesting there are chairs set up in a way that looks like the mortician was expecting guests for the funeral. This could just be their attempt at making it feel normal or official for themselves, but it could also indicate this place wasn't exactly a secret to other survivors in the area and was actually visited frequently by those looking to honor the dead. Although, admittedly, that is purely speculation with no further evidence, but it does help flesh out some of the foggier aspects of the story later on. Regardless, during their time taking refuge within, Daryl and Beth would be visited by a dog at the front door which doesn't act hostile, but flees in fear when approached by Daryl. Obviously, this dog wasn't feral as it didn't attack, and although anything is possible, dogs don't typically approach random doorsteps unless they're familiar with the home as they heavily rely on scent. So to me, it's obvious this dog belonged to the mortician and had been attempting to come home for a couple days with no answer at the door. So we have a perfectly maintained and relatively secured base with everything left behind, including food, water, and a dog, but no owner. If the mortician was simply off looting the area for whatever reason, you'd think the dog would be with them or at the very least be able to track them down, but it's not. It's coming home every day expecting its owner but never finding them. A dog's nose is extremely powerful. There's no doubt in my mind this little guy would be running circles around its owner even if they were a walker, if they were anywhere in the area. Hell, we even see this happen in Fear, so maybe they're a lot farther away than we thought. But despite the good times being had while taking shelter within the home, this night would end in tragedy, as while enjoying a couple cans of pig's feet and peanut butter, Daryl and Beth would hear the dog return while whimpering outside, but instead of opening the door to a hungry little guy looking for its owner, the door would be forced open as a horde of hungry little guys suddenly flood in. Now, on the surface, there isn't much of a mystery here. The dog encountered a herd and retreated home, accidentally leading the walkers right to the doorstep. But there are a few things that make the setup seem a bit shady to me, so I'm gonna choose to get a little tinfoil hat with this one. You see, the random horde passing through when Daryl and Beth are inside is convenient, but by itself isn't really suspicious, as we do see this sort of thing happen all the time. But after getting separated from each other while fleeing the house, Daryl would make his way out to the road, just as we see Beth's bag lying on the ground with a mysterious car seemingly kidnapping her right then and there. We would later learn these were the Atlanta cops within Grady Memorial Hospital out on a patrol looking for injured survivors, who claim to help those in need of care, although really just exploit them for labor by indefinitely keeping them in debt. But with that being said, their explanation for what happened that night after Beth comes back to consciousness just doesn't add up. They affirm they just happened to have found her on the road passed out with a giant head wound and fractured wrist alongside a walker only inches away from digging in, which they took out, with Beth only remembering fighting off a walker before suddenly blacking out. But how does any of that make sense? She doesn't say she fell over while fighting a walker, she says she was fending one off before everything went black. I get her foot was injured, but she seems far more hurt than she would have been from a simple fall. And if she was as close to death as they claim she was before taking out the walker that almost got her, then where is the body or evidence of a fight? And why are there barely any walkers around the road she was taken from when Daryl finally makes it out? They're almost all inside or around the house, whereas Beth looks to have actually gone to a relatively safe distance with only one walker even remotely within range of the road. So unless Gorman here just punched the walker a couple times and called it a day instead of killing it, the whole lack of a body thing is just kinda confusing all around. But with all the sketchiness surrounding the cops' presence here at this exact time, the holes in logic with their account of the situation, and their extensive history of corruption, I'd feel confident in saying this whole situation was no accident at all. This place was turned into a trap set up by the Grady Memorial cops who sicked a herd on the two and covertly attacked Beth when she was alone and distracted in order to act as heroes who she will soon need to repay, which fits right in line with the corruption shown off during their time in Season 5. Now, this isn't to say the funeral home was purely bait from the get-go. Clearly someone did live there and maintain these bodies in order to honor them in death. It would be really weird for the cops to embalm the bodies when the supplies alone would probably be enough to lure someone into staying. Instead, what I believe happened here was a classic takeover merely days before Beth and Daryl's arrival. The cops orchestrated an injury to the mortician before feigning heroes, who would take them from their home and force them to work off their debt, while maintaining and restocking their place in the days following in hopes of repeating the cycle. Somebody with this type of anatomical knowledge and skills would be desired in a hospital setting. So if you consider the idea that other survivors in the area knew of the funeral home and frequently visited out of honor, perhaps word got out a little farther than expected. They couldn't just straight up kidnap someone. That wouldn't fit the narrative of owing them for their work. Instead, they faked dire scenarios that forced these survivors into servitude. So, in a way, it's as if the funeral home was never abandoned, but simply changed owners. Regardless, now that we've laid all the evidence out, I am now going to attempt to retell the story in a more cohesive and dramatic way, but remember, I am just theorizing based on what I've noticed, and admittedly, I'm getting a bit more creative here than usual, so it's entirely possible I could misinterpret or miss some evidence altogether. But this is where you guys come in. I'd love to hear what you believe happened here in the comments down below. When the dead began to walk around the world on August 27, 2010, the Georgia authorities had directed most civilians to head towards Atlanta in an effort to protect the population all in one place. Those who ignored these orders and stayed behind were largely looking to take advantage of the situation by looting whatever abandoned houses or businesses they could. But some were simply too afraid to flee their homes, or in the case of many, believed they stood a better chance taking on the calamity alone, which was the case of a mortician living within his funeral home along with his dog out in the Georgian woods. This individual was always a kind, generous person looking to help their community during hard times in the pre-outbreak world. It wasn't just a business, but a home where friends and family were welcome to visit their past loved ones whenever they pleased. And during the wake of the apocalypse, this never changed. The world had become a walking graveyard, but to the mortician, this didn't mean these lost souls shouldn't be honored in death all the same. So over the next few months, they would begin setting up bear traps around the outskirts of their property, complete with bait in hopes of immobilizing passing walkers, before putting them down and beginning work on restoring them in a presentable way while eventually burying them. Some would see this as creepy, an isolated individual playing dress up with bodies in the woods, but others would see it as a beautiful way to pay their respects to the lost. And in time, the mortician would begin receiving visitors just like in the pre-outbreak days. There was always the risk of encountering plunderers, but for the most part, these visitors were civilized neighbors, mostly consisting of farmers who had managed to survive on their own crops, much like Herschel and the Green family, who simply came to pay their respects in hopes of restoring some sort of normality in their lives. And once a sense of trust was established, these visitors would begin bringing their own deceased loved ones in order to give them the proper burial they deserve, often exchanging canned foods and other resources with the mortician for their services. It was a rare case of actual peace in the apocalypse. Approaching strangers weren't seen as threats, but instead welcomed company, as a dog didn't exactly make for a good conversationalist. Although, these positive interactions would slowly build a sense of naivety within the mortician that would leave them unprepared for bad actors. But as the days continued to pass over the next 2 years, providing this service had become the mortician's main role in the world. Even when visitors started becoming scarce, they, along with their dog, continued their work day in and day out. In theory, they could have kept at this until they grew old, but the fragile peace they had built simply couldn't last forever, as come one fateful evening in late 2012, the mortician would receive a couple unexpected visitors consisting of 2 Atlanta PD officers who were running low on food and in desperate need of shelter. The 2 claimed to be from a hospital within the big city looking for survivors in need of help and simply ran into trouble themselves, which the mortician had accepted as true before welcoming the 2 in. But in reality, this was a lie. These officers were well aware of who this mortician was, as word of a man utilizing his skills to embalm and bury the dead in a well-stocked and fortified home had traveled through the grapevine. A lone man with anatomical knowledge and basic surgical skills was like gold just waiting to be taken to these officers. Their home base of Grady Memorial Hospital only had a couple doctors and nurses to treat their various patients. Patients who were effectively property of the cops who had to obey their will. So although the mortician was kind enough to allow the officers to stay the night, this would turn out to be their biggest mistake, as come the next morning, the officers would volunteer to help the mortician with their work to thank them for their hospitality by setting up bear traps on the property's outskirts to capture walkers, just as he had been doing for years now. However, this was actually the first step in their nefarious plan, as while distracted with their work embalming bodies in the basement, the cops would covertly steal the mortician's dog and hide it in their car's trunk before frantically claiming to have seen it get chased into the woods by a walker. And without even thinking or questioning the situation, the mortician would drop everything they were doing as is and sprint into the woods where the cops had directed. And within seconds, Snap. The mortician had unknowingly run straight into the cops' planted bear trap. The plan worked perfectly with no suspicions, and now that the mortician needed something from the cops, they were free to scoop them up and throw them in their car while secretly ushering the dog out of the trunk into the bush before taking off towards Atlanta without even locking the funeral home's door, which would be the last time the mortician would ever see their home or dog again. After arriving at Grady Memorial, they would be treated for their injuries, but now owed the cops for what they took, which essentially meant they were now the property of the officers and had to adapt to their new way of life. Although, the officers here weren't finished with the funeral home yet. People knew of this place and frequently visited in hopes of honoring their loved ones. It was a trusted location among local survivors, so by the next day, the officers would return and clean up whatever mess was left behind and restock the shelves. They knew somebody would eventually stop in and stay when they noticed the mortician was gone, and when that happened, they would strike all over again. This is exactly what we see happen to Daryl and Beth. This place was only one of many stops on the cops' weekly patrol routes, and they were watching the two the entire time, even seeing the dog approach the door and run back into the woods, which would spark an idea in their heads. They didn't want Daryl, as they knew they couldn't control someone like that. They wanted Beth and needed to separate them, so spending the evening driving around the area while rounding up as many walkers as possible, the cops would pull up to the funeral home that night while surrounded before cutting the engine, as all they had to do now was wait. And eventually, like clockwork, the dog would run by and approach the funeral home looking for its dinner, leading the hungry horde straight to the doorstep. And once the walkers were cleared and Beth was alone, the officers would sneak up and strike her in the head before loading her up and taking off to Atlanta once again. This was the corruption of the Grady Memorial cops on full display, and judging by how far outside the city they were for patrol, I'd imagine this wasn't the only location they had set up as bait. I can't really see this tactic continuing after the death of Dawn and the other corrupt officers, so I'd say it's safe to assume the funeral home simply fell into disrepair over time. But as for the mortician, well, it's impossible to know exactly who they were. But I think it's more than likely they could have been any of the patients we see within Grady Memorial, as they'd probably still be in some stage of recovery and wouldn't have yet earned the respect and privileges Dr. Stevens had. Maybe it was this guy, or this person. Hell, maybe it was Percy here. But regardless of their identity or fate, I can't help but notice how the bear trap setup in the intro scene almost mirrors what we see go down within this home. The bait acts as a metaphor for the house and the goods within, the cops were the bear trap itself, and the walker was the unlucky soul to wander inside. Now, typically after the story section, I give a brief overview on what works well and what might be a little dicey in terms of logic. But in this case, a mistake may have been made on my end. Somehow, with this scene, I completely missed the Talking Dead interview with Scott Gimple where he briefly discussed the backstory of the mortician, where he claims they died mundanely while looking for meds, and apparently the scene was so epic they didn't bother to film it and it was only meant for them. Yeah, I don't know about that. As I always say, these videos aren't meant to convince you I'm right, just to flex our creative skills using The Walking Dead as a playground. After finding this quote, I really debated scrapping this whole video, but in the end, this was probably one of my favorite stories to piece together in a while, and I'd love to see something like this developed for a Tales episode or webisode over watching a man mundanely die from a lack of meds. Maybe that's just me, but with that, I'm extremely curious to hear your thoughts on my interpretation of the story in the comments down below. Did you enjoy it? Do you prefer Scott's explanation? Or do you think we're both wrong and have a better interpretation? I want to hear all about it. But that's going to do it for me today, folks. As always, thank you so much for watching.